Hello, this is Dr. Nielsen. Today we're going to be talking about plant evolution. We're going to be focusing on the basal plants. What I mean by basal plants, I mean the plant taxa that are at the bottom of the plant family, the plant evolutionary tree. So these are the plants that first made that transition from the aquatic environment to the terrestrial environment. So these plant species, in order to survive on this new drier environment, had to have certain adaptations to allow them to do that. Some of these plant species you will be in taxa you will be familiar with, others not so much. But your learning objectives for today is to understand these challenges that these first plants faced as they colonized dry land. It was a very different environment for them, and so they had to have adaptations to allow them to survive and reproduce on this land. Some of these adaptations are structural and morphological, some of them are physiological. So I want you to understand these challenges and these adaptations today. I also want you to understand the alternation of generations life cycle and how it has been modified over the course of plant evolution. The alternation of generations life cycle is a life cycle that we see in the plant kingdom. It can be kind of hard to grasp at first, but we'll be discussing it this week and next week. What I want you to focus on is understanding this and understanding how it changes in the different plant taxa we'll be discussing. You also need to know the major plant groups and the characters that define them. And you need to understand the ecological and economic importance of plants, the basal plants, and then next week the seed plants. So I often get the question, why do we have to study plants? We're not interested in plants, we're people. Why do plants matter? So you should be aware that plants are multicellular photosynthetic eukaryotes, right? And because plants are photosynthetic, which you will be learning all about in lecture soon, they are primary producers, right? So plants are able to convert energy from the sun into chemical energy, which supports their own growth and reproduction and supports all other forms of terrestrial life, be it our animals or other types of life forms like the fungi and decomposers. So plants also produce oxygen and they remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So they remove CO2 during photosynthesis, and oxygen is produced as a byproduct of photosynthesis. So in addition to supporting animals with oxygen and supporting animals with biomass, with sugar, right? Plants are also important as sources of fuel. So the coal deposits that are around Pennsylvania were formed from plants that died a long time ago, but also modern day biofuels and the ethanol that supplements the gasoline that you put in your car. That ethanol comes from plants, mainly corn that we grow in very large quantities of in this country. So we get shelter, we get materials like wood and paper fiber, cotton fiber, linen. All these products come from plants. We also obtain medications from plants. One example of a medication from a plant is artemisinin, which is isolated from the wormwood plant and is used to treat malaria, which is still a major cause of death and illness in many of the tropical regions of the world. And we need to understand how plants work, how plants have evolved, how their physiologies have evolved to balance out the need for carbon dioxide while reducing water loss. These are all really important because we need to grow and harvest more crops. Even if you don't like to eat vegetables or fruit, if you just like to eat hamburgers and cheeseburgers, you still need to understand that you would not have that hamburger if it wasn't for plants. In order to have the cow, you need to have the grass for the cow to eat, right? And so the human population is continuing to increase in size, but unfortunately, we're not meeting the crop production requirements that we're going to need to feed the people, we think, as early as 2050. So this is it's very important for us to understand plants in order to increase plant production so that we're not faced with a major humanitarian crisis in the next few decades. Compounding this is the fact that we're living in a very changing environment in terms of climate. Increasing CO2 concentrations, more extreme weather conditions, so more flooding and more droughts. These all pose an additional challenge to farming and producing the food to meet the needs of a growing human population. So let's talk now a little bit about the ancestry of land plants. So today, botanists and plant taxonomists can use not only morphological information based on looking at similar characters between different plants in order to infer evolutionary history, they can also use DNA sequence information. And based on morphological and biochemical, and DNA sequence information, we think that plants likely evolved from freshwater algae about 590 million years ago. Green algae and land plants have sequence similarity, but they also have some other similarities in terms of function and structure. So both these groups contain chlorophyll, and which they use to capture light energy from the sun. And they also have similar accessory pigments that are used primarily in phytoprotection. They also both store excess carbohydrates as starch, and they have cellulose in their cell walls. Land plants, though, are different from algae in the fact that they nourish and protect their embryos. And we do not see that in green algae. So this is a seed here from a land plant called Capsella. And what seeds are a way that plants protect their embryo. So this is the embryo here. And then you'll see the seed is surrounded by a coating called the seed coat. And it also contains a food source that nourishes the embryo during development. This is a green algae embryo here. You can see that it's exposed to the environment. There's no real buffer layer or any kind of coat protecting it. And it's also has to develop independent of the parent. So there's no nourishment provided by the parent to this embryo. In terms of the green algae, land plants are most closely related to a taxa called the charophytes. So charophytes, they also have these similarities such as cellulose in the cell walls. The chlorophylls specifically they have are A and B, which is what land plants have. And charophytes also kind of have a more complex structure. You can see they're kind of plant-like. They don't look like just a bunch of cells stuck together. They have a little bit more of an organization to them. And they also have what's called plasmodesmata or desmata, depending on who you talk to. And what plasmodesmata are membrane-lined channels through plant cell walls, or in this case, algae cell walls, that allow for the exchange of materials and signaling molecules and hormones between the plant. So remember, plant cells can't move. They are surrounded by this rigid cell wall. So these channels act as bridges between the cells. So this would be a membrane-lined channel here, and it allows for the passage of different materials between two cells. We see plasmodesmata in all the different land plants, and we also see it, here's chara here, we also see it in these charophytes, okay? So they have these channels that allow for the exchange of information between other plants. These channels are not present in other forms of green algae. So charophytes and land plants are placed in the same clade or the same monophyletic group when we are recreating the evolutionary history of plants. The common ancestor, though, no longer exists. So this is the evolutionary history of plants, summarized in a phylogenetic tree. And when I say monophyletic group, what I mean is the monophyletic group consists of a common ancestor and all its descendants, okay? So a good rule of thumb, if you're looking at a phylogeny or an evolutionary history like this, evolutionary tree, a monophyletic group would be a group of taxa that can be isolated with one snip of the tree, okay? So if we snip here at the common green algae ancestor, you can see that we're going to isolate all the land plants and the charophytes, okay? So they make a monophyletic group. We could also snip the tree here, right? And we can get a common ancestor and the flowering plants, the angiosperms and the gymnosperms, okay? So this would also make up a monophyletic group comprising of the seed plants. So if you look at a tree like this, you can figure out how many monophyletic groups we have by calculating how many different groups you can isolate with one snip, right? So we can have the whole tree here, one monophyletic group, a monophyletic group here, 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 here. So that gives us 7 potential monophyletic groups. So remember that one snip rule. Some other terminology I want to get a review is an ancestral trait versus a derived trait. So an ancestral trait is a character or trait that is present in a group of taxa and also the most recent common ancestor, right? So if we were talking about all of the plants in Chara here, an ancestral trait would be the presence of chlorophyll A and B. These molecules are present in all of them and also in all the plants and the common ancestor, the charophytes. If we were talking about an ancestral trait in the seed plants here, or in the seed plants, we could say that an ancestral trait would be megaphylls, right? So megaphylls are larger leaves. These are found in common ancestors, and they're also found in the current taxa. Now, if we wanted to talk about a derived trait is a trait that's found only in the group that you're discussing and not in the most recent common ancestor. So in the case of flowering plants, fruit and flowers would be a derived trait because it wouldn't be present in the common ancestor. In terms of the angiosperms, though, seeds would be an ancestral trait because they were present in all angiosperms and were also present in the most recent common ancestor. So make sure you understand the ancestral traits and derived traits. We're going to be focusing today on some of these derived traits that were very important in terms of the establishment of plants on land. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that land plants face. So Chara, remember, is a freshwater aquatic algae, right? So Chara, it doesn't have to worry about drying out at all, right? And during all stages of development, embryo through adult, it won't dry out because it lives in a moist environment. Chara can also float in the water and be floppy, right? The water kind of supports its tissues. So Chara doesn't have to deal with gravity. The water also protects Chara from excessive UV radiation, which we do not see in land plants. So what are some of these plant adaptations that arose in order to deal with some of these challenges? So let's talk first about drying out. So one thing that we see with the land plant is that they're covered with what's called a waxy cuticle. So this is a layer that surrounds the entire plant. It's it protects against the loss of water through the plant body. So it's waxy, it's hydrophobic, right? So it makes it very difficult. It's like this waterproofing layer. Plants are covered with an entire raincoat, right? That keeps the water in, but it also keeps other things out, right? So land plants also have what are called stomata. These are pores on the undersides of the leaves, usually, sometimes on the tops of leaves as well. And what these leaves do is they facilitate gas exchange with the environment, right? So it's through these pores that carbon dioxide enters the plant and water vapor gets evaporated from the leaf. Now, what's really cool about stomata is that the size of these pores can be controlled by these cells here, which are called guard cells. They can change the they can change the size of these pores by regulating different types of ions that enter and exit the cells and changing the amount of water in each cell. And this causes the pores to open and close. Plants, some land plants also have a vascular system. This is a specific type of tissue system that allows the transport of materials through the plant. So we have what's called xylem tissue, which transports water from the ground up through the top of the plant. And then we have phloem tissue, which transports sugar and other plant metabolites throughout the plant. The other function of the vascular system is to help support the plant body. Again, plants have to deal with gravity. They don't have water to kind of support them. So the vascular tissue helps support the plant. So this is an example. This is the xylem tissue. So this is how it does it. So this is xylem tissue, and it has these little rings around it. And this is made out of a really, really strong organic molecule called lignin. And it's almost like having like a little tiny miniature beam through the plants that helps support it. Plants are also three-dimensional, right? So they're composed mostly of three-dimensional tissues, and this allows them to have reduced water loss because it has a reduced surface area, right? So they get thicker, and this allows them to have less surface area while maintaining the ability to undergo photosynthesis. So by having more three-dimensional structure, having thicker leaves and thicker stems, this also helps prevent water loss. Land plants also are exposed to more UV light than aquatic algae. This can lead to mutations, right? So UV light is bad. We use UV light sometimes to purposely induce mutations in organisms. So UV light can cause DNA to break, can cause mutations. So plants have to deal with this in some way. And what we'll see is that land plants will have, for the most part, will exist having a diploid genome. And having a diploid genome is really, really important because if you get a mutation in one allele, then you kind of have a backup allele in order to let you survive. So what we'll see is that terrestrial plants have both a diploid and a haploid generation. And the diploid generation is going to allow for more genetic variability in land plants and more protection against things like mutation, but also for things like changing environments. And what this leads us to is what's called the alternation of generations life cycle. So here we're going to start talking about these different generations, the diploid and the haploid generation. Okay, so what the alternation of generations means is that plants are going to have two alternating multicellular forms within one life cycle. They exist in a multicellular haploid form and a multicellular diploid form. This multicellular diploid form you should be familiar with, right? That's like animals. We're all diploid, we're multicellular. It's this multicellular haploid form. So having only one copy of each chromosome and being multicellular, that is a little different than what you're used to dealing with. So let's define some of these generations. Let's start with what's called the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is going to be the diploid generation in plants. It's going to be multicellular, and it's going to produce something that we're going to call spores, which are haploid, by meiosis. Okay? So you can remember this sporophyte. Phyte means plant. This is going to be the spore-producing plant. It's diploid. It's going to make spores, which are haploid, by meiosis. So these haploid spores are able to grow and reproduce via mitosis, okay? So these haploid spores develop into a new organism without having to fuse with another reproductive cell. So they're going to divide through mitosis to form a multicellular haploid form. And this haploid multicellular form is called the gametophyte, okay? So gametophyte, haploid. A gametophyte, it's multicellular, and it's going to produce gametes. So remember, phyte means plant. This is going to be the gamete-producing generation. So this haploid multicellular form, they're going to produce the egg and the sperm, okay? But it's not going to be through meiosis because it's already haploid. So what this means is that the gametophyte are going to produce eggs and sperm via mitosis, which will then fuse to form the zygote, right? And that gets us back to diploid cell, which will then grow via mitosis to form the next generation of the sporophyte. So let's just look at a diagram of this to review it. This is very important. You need to understand this diagram. If you understand this diagram, it's going to make everything so much easier, okay? All right, so let's start with the sporophyte here. So this is the diploid form. The sporophyte is going to have different types of cells called sporangium on it. These sporangium are the cells that are going to undergo meiosis. So when any diploid cell undergoes meiosis, you're going to result in haploid, right? So these sporangium are going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. These haploid spores are then going to what we call germinate. So they're going to grow and divide by mitosis, right? By mitosis to produce a multicellular haploid gametophyte. This gametophyte is then going to undergo, parts of this gametophyte are then going to undergo mitosis to produce our gametes, our egg, and our sperm, which will then come together via fertilization to form the diploid zygote. So this part should be fairly clear. It's this part here that is unique, okay? And so the land plants differ as to which generation is going to be dominant, or sometimes we call this conspicuous. So which generation is going to be the most long-lived, the one that you kind of like look at and say, okay, that's the plant, right? So what we see is that some of the very, very basal plants, so one example is moss, is that the dominant generation is the gametophyte. So when you see that fluffy green moss growing in the woods, what you're looking at is a haploid organism. This is the gametophyte of moss. The sporophyte, may have also seen, is this little structure that comes up and has a little capsule at the end of it. This is the sporophyte. This is the diploid structure of moss. As we move up the plant evolutionary tree, what we see is that the gametophyte becomes smaller and reduced in size, but also reduced in terms of long-livedness, right? So in ferns, when you see a fern growing in the woods, you probably associate this with being a fern. This is actually the sporophyte. So this is going to be the diploid generation. The haploid generation, if you look very carefully, you will see this is the gametophyte of a fern. This is the haploid generation. They can vary in size. They can be microscopic to maybe like the size of like half of a pinky nail. This is the gametophyte of the fern. So this is going to produce, this is the haploid generation that's going to produce the eggs and the sperm. Now, if you keep walking in the woods and you see a pine tree, the pine tree is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte has become even smaller. So the gametophytes now, there's two types of gametophytes because the sporophyte here is going to produce two types of spores, okay? It's going to produce megaspores, which are going to produce, eventually will germinate into will become the female gametophyte and produce the egg, and it's going to produce microspores, which are actually the pollen. So when you see pollen on a pine tree, that is actually the microgametophyte, and it will form the male gametophyte here. So we have the female gametophyte and the male gametophyte. These will give rise to sperm and egg. So they're very, very small. At this point, it's microscopic. And then when we get to angiosperms, they're even smaller, okay? So again, they're heterosporous. The sporophyte's going to produce megaspores and microspores, which will divide to form the female or megagametophyte and the male, the microgametophyte, which will produce sperm and eggs. All right, so this is the general trend we see in plant evolution. Okay, so let's start by talking about some of these basal plants. So we're going to begin with the bryophytes. Okay, so the bryophytes are going to be the non-vascular plants. So when we talked about plants having a vascular system, we talked about them having xylem and phloem. This helped support the plant, help transport materials. These plants do not have a vascular system. The bryophytes are going to include hornworts, liverworts, and the mosses. You're probably only familiar with the mosses. These hornworts and liverworts are a little bit harder to find. So the bryophytes were the first plants to colonize land. They lack a vascular tissue, so they don't have any way to transport water or nutrients throughout the plant. So that means they're very, very short. They're very low-lying to the ground because they don't have the support tissue and they don't have the means to transport materials through them. They also do not have true roots or stems or leaves. The dominant generation, as we discussed before, is going to be the gametophyte, okay? So the gametophyte is going to be here. This is the gametophyte structure, and it produces eggs in a structure called the archegonia, and it produces flagellated sperm in the antheridia. The fact that the sperm is flagellated is important because what this means is that the sperm have to actually swim to the egg in a foam of water. So water is still required, a moist environment is required for moss and bryophyte reproduction. So again, the green part here is going to be the gametophyte. This part here is the sporophyte. All right, so let's talk about the liverworts. So the liverworts, one example is called Marcantia. So the liverworts have a very flat, leafy appearance. They don't have true roots. They have structures called rhizoids, which are little hairy extensions that help anchor the plant to the soil. And they can absorb a little bit, but they're not true roots because they don't have vascular tissue. Bryophytes and liverworts, they can reproduce either sexually or asexually. So sexual reproduction depends on the two types of stalks that will form. We have the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte here. These are going to bear the antheridia or the archegonia. And those are the type of tissues that are actually going to produce the gametophyte. Once they produce the gametes, so the eggs and the sperm, the embryo will fertilize. The embryo will form via fertilization, and it actually develops like right on the gametophyte into the sporophyte. So if we look at this is the female gametophyte here. So the sperm will have to be produced by the male gametophyte and it relies on water for fertilization. And then the sporophyte here actually just kind of like grows out of the gametophyte. These will release spores, which will then go on to develop into a new male or female sporophyte. We also have something called hornworts. So hornworts have small photosynthetic sporophytes, and they come out of a very thin gametophyte. So they also carry out photosynthesis. So both the sporophyte and the gametophyte are photosynthetic. They're going to live in very moist, shady environments. Again, they they need water for reproduction, and they also need water because they can't transport it very well. So they also have a symbiotic relationship. So that is a positive relationship or a mutualism with a bacteria that allows, that can actually fix nitrogen from the air. So the plant provides the bacteria with a source of sugar, and the cyanobacteria provides the plant with nitrogen. They can also reproduce asexually through what's called fragmentation. So they don't have to go through the alternation of generations. Chunks of the gametophyte can kind of fall off and then form another organism. Okay, so then we have the mosses, which you're probably the most familiar with. So this is the largest phyla of the non-vascular plants. Bryophytes are cool because they have a very high desiccation tolerance. So they can almost completely dry out. They stop growing, they look brown, they look dead. And then once they are exposed to more water and moisten up a bit, they can resume growth. So these are the type of mechanisms that are kind of really cool that we want to study more in order to, help increase crop yields in changing environments. So understanding how mosses can do that can actually benefit us now in terms of food productivity. Mosses, again, the dominant generation is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is always going to be attached to the gametophyte. So gametophyte here, and then this is the sporophyte here. Gametophyte produces the gametes, sporophyte's going to produce spores. So mosses actually have a very, very important importance. They are commercially important because they are a fuel source. The sphagnum peat bogs in Europe, important source of fuel. You also learn about some other functions of moss in lab next week. They're also ecologically important because peat bogs retain a whole bunch of carbon. So when the peat dies, they sink to the bottom of these wet, moist areas, and they don't decompose. So they're carbon stored in the ground, which is important because we want carbon in the ground. We don't want carbon in the atmosphere. Mosses are also ecologically important because they're important for ecological succession and building soil. So mosses can grow on rocks, and they can slowly dissolve bits of that rock by different types of enzymes and other types of chemicals that they secrete. And this is one of the mechanisms that soil is built. So it's important for soil building and ecological succession, for example, after the retreat of a glacier. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about the vascular plants. So the vascular plants are the most dominant plants in our world today. They are much larger than the bryophytes because they have roots and vascular tissue and that can conduct nutrients and water. So again, we have the xylem, which conducts water from the roots up through the plant. We have phloem, which conducts sucrose and other types of metabolites throughout the plant. These plants also have lignin, so this strengthens the cell walls and it gives the plant structure. Most of the seedless vascular plants, which we're going to talk about, are going to be homosporous. So that means they only produce one type of spore. they produce more spores than bryophytes. So they will produce a whole bunch of spores compared to bryophytes, which is going to increase the dispersal of the organism on land. This is called Cooksonia, and we think this was one of the earliest vascular plants. This doesn't exist today, but we have fossils of Cooksonia. So the vascular plants are going to include a group of plants that are going to be called the Lycopodia, the club mosses, the lycophytes. You may have seen this growing around the forest. Sometimes people refer to this as ground pine. These are all going to have a dominant sporophyte. So this is the sporophyte, the diploid form, and then the smaller box, I've shown you what the gametophyte looks like. So in all these seedless vascular plants, the sporophyte is going to be dominant. Also includes ferns, the other plant you're probably familiar with. So ferns are seedless vascular plants, sporophyte dominant. Two that you may have never seen before are horsetails here and whisk ferns. Okay, so let's first talk about the lycophytes. So these are the club mosses or ground pine. So the club mosses have stems, roots, and leaves, but these leaves are referred to as microphyls. So they're really, really small. They only have one strand of vascular tissue. So these are the tiny little leaves here. These larger structures here are branches. They're not true leaves. So these are the microphyls, so these small, tiny leaves. And the sporangia, so the spore-producing tissues, the cells that are going to undergo meiosis to produce spores, are found in a structure called a strobolus or strobili for plural. Again, the sporophyte generation is dominant. And some of the lycophytes have spores that grow into one type of gametophyte. Those are called homosporous. Others have two types of spores called heterosporous, though most of them are homosporous. Again, the microspores become the male gametophyte, and the megaspores will become the female gametophyte and produce the appropriate type of gamete. Gametes, the gametophyte is reduced. It resembles the gametophyte of the liverwort. So it's really kind of tall, small and flat. Kind of looks like a piece of lettuce or something. And these are going to include the ground pines like Lycopodium, which grow around us, and also the spike mosses such as Selaginella. All right, let's now talk about the pteridophytes, which are going to include the ferns, the horsetails, and the whisk ferns. So these are seedless vascular plants. These plants were dominant from the late Devonian through the Carboniferous period. And during the Carboniferous period, they were very, very tall. Some of these plants could be up to 35, 40 meters tall. So this group is going to include the ferns. It's sometimes also called the fern allies, which are the horsetails and the whisk ferns. Again, in this group, it's going to have a dominant sporophyte and a reduced gametophyte. And the sporophyte is actually going to grow out of the gametophyte. These plants, though, are going to have larger leaves. These leaves are called megaphylls, okay? So they're not going to have these tiny little leaves. They're going to have megaphylls. And it is going to allow the plants to more efficiently collect solar energy. So they'll be able to have higher rates of photosynthesis. They'll be able to produce more food to support a larger organism. And this having megaphylls resulted in increased fitness for plants on land. Okay, so here we have the horsetails. So these horsetails are kind of really cool. Some people think they look like asparagus, but they're not at all related to asparagus. The horsetails live in very wet, marshy environments, and while they have true leaves, the megaphylls, they're still pretty small. So these are the leaves here. They form in whorls at the different little joints here. So there's these little nodes or joints along the plant. These are branches, and the spores are going to produce again and found in the structure called the strobolus. So the strobolus is going to contain the sporangia, which is going to undergo meiosis to produce spores. These are also called scouring rushes because they have silica embedded into their cell walls, and they were used, for example, in North America by Native Americans in order to like clean things. So scouring rushes. Next up is the whisk ferns. This is a plant you've probably never seen before. It does not grow around us at all. Whisk ferns do grow though in tropical regions. You can find them down in Florida. And they often exist as epiphytes. So these are plants that live on other types of plants. So this is called Silotum. This actually lacks leaves. So it's all stem, but it does have a true root and true vascular tissue. And it has a very inconspicuous gametophyte. Sporophyte is dominant. And it produces the sporangia on these little side branches, and they're like little pumpkin-shaped sporangia, which will then go on to form the spores. Okay, next up is ferns. Ferns is going to be the largest group in the seedless vascular plants. There's approximately 11,000 varieties of ferns. Most of ferns grow in tropical areas, but they are found throughout the world. We see them in temperate regions. We even see them in very, very cold regions. Ferns can range in size from 1 centimeter. They have very small aquatic ferns to very, very large ferns that are called tree ferns that can grow up to 20 meters in height. Ferns have very large megaphylls that we call fronds. So again, they have very large leaves. They can be divided up into leaflets, or they can be one single leaf. Sporangia are in clusters called sori on the undersides of the frond. So if you ever flipped a frond over and seen all these little dots on the back, that is the sporangia. And so that is the tissue that's going to divide to form by meiosis to form the spores. And there's often a layer called on top of the sori called the indusia that protects the sporangia. In terms of life cycle, again, with all seedless vascular plants, the fern life cycle has a dominant sporophyte. And the dominant sporophyte is going to produce spores that are dispersed by the wind. These spores will germinate, so they'll divide by mitosis to grow into a heart-shaped gametophyte, which is called a prothallus or prothalli for plural, which can produce sperm, eggs, or both, depending. So they can produce a female gametophyte or a male gametophyte. And then the sperm are flagellated, and they have to swim from a structure called the antheridium, where the sperm is produced, to the archegonium, where the egg is produced. And fertilization is going to occur in the archegonium. Now, this can occur on the same gametophyte if it produces both male and female male and female gametes, or it can be produced on different gametophytes and different organisms. So all of the basal plants require water for fertilization, okay? So the sperm have to swim to the egg. This is important, and we're going to see that this changes as we move up to seed plants. So the gametophyte is short-lived, so the sporophyte will grow right out of the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte will disappear, and the sporophyte is going to be completely independent from the gametophyte. Okay, so let's just go over this briefly. So let's start with the sporophyte here. This is a fern sporophyte, so this is the diploid structure. The sporophyte is going to produce these structures called sori, sorus for singular, and they are going to contain within it sporangia, okay? So the sporangia are the cells that are going to undergo meiosis to produce spores, right? So we have sporangia undergoing meiosis to produce spores. The sori will crack open, and these spores will be released and blown into the wind. The spores will then undergo mitosis or germinate to start growing into what we call the prothallus. It's heart-shaped here. You can see it's called a heart-shaped gametophyte. This example is showing both archegonium and antheridium. So this is on the bottom part of the gametophyte, so along the ground. So you'd have to flip these over to look at them if you found them in the woods. And so the archegonium is going to produce the egg. The antheridium is usually down at the point of the heart, and these are going to produce the sperm. The sperm are flagellated and they will have to swim to the egg for fertilization. This is showing fertilization on the same gametophyte, but again, this can occur between gametophytes. So once we have fertilization, the diploid zygote will undergo mitosis and grow to form a young sporophyte. And so here's the gametophyte here, and the young sporophyte is going to grow right out of the gametophyte. The gametophyte will eventually die, leaving the next generation of the sporophyte. So this is the life cycle of the fern. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of what ferns look like. You have these very, very small aquatic ferns. This is called salvinia, to very, very large tree ferns. Some of the ferns will have dissected leaves here made up of leaflets. Other ferns will have broadleaves. This is called a staghorn fern. It's a really, really cool fern. It actually grows as an epiphyte, so it grows on other plants. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of what ferns can look like. We have uses of ferns, so there are edible ferns. So the ostrich fern, which grows around us, is eaten when the leaves are young. You may have seen fiddlehead ferns on a menu or in the store in the early spring. So ferns can be eaten. This is a water fern called azolla. Azolla has a symbiotic relationship with a cyanobacteria. So the cyanobacteria is able to fix nitrogen. And so this fern is grown in rice paddies where it produces nitrogen to fertilize the rice plants. So it's a really cool example of like a co-agricultural system. So this is good because it means that they don't have to add chemical fertilizer to the rice paddies when you grow this fern with the rice. Ferns and different allies are also used as medicines in parts of China, in Chinese medicines. Extracts of ferns have also been used as pesticides, so there's toxins produced by ferns that can kill insects. And ferns are also used as a decoration, right? So this is a Boston fern. That's a common decorative plant. I also just want to mention that these plants, while we think of them as being kind of really small and inconspicuous, during the Carboniferous period, so this is the late Paleozoic, Western Pennsylvania was a tropical swamp, and there were just tons of giant horsetails and ferns and lycopods everywhere. So this is a recreation of what Western Pennsylvania would have looked like based on the fossils that have been found in the area. So you can see these giant lycopods. The club mosses were huge, and big tree ferns, and here's a large horsetail here. And so why I'm telling you this is what happened is all these big, gigantic basal plants died, and they sank to the bottom of the swamps. And over time, more stuff fell on them, so you had time and you had pressure, and what you ended up with was coal, right? So the coal deposits in our area are the long dead horsetails, ferns, lycopods, and mosses that once were very, very common in our environment. And it turns out our area here is a really, really good place to find some of these Carboniferous plant fossils. So actually along Route 51, along the road caught just south of the Amber-Jalaquipa Bridge, is actually one of the best sites for collecting different types of plant fossils. This here is a horsetail fossil, and here you can see a fern fossil. So I put a text or a link up here if you want to check out some local fossil hunting resources for you. So it's kind of a cool local connection to these basal plants that we've been talking about today. All right, so you're going to have the opportunity to look at some of these basal plants firsthand in lab next week. Make sure you bring your book and you review the notes before lab. Thanks. Bye.